They bumped a 70-year-old war hero to coach. What happened next? Shut the whole airport down. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside for a moment. James Carter Thompson blinked slowly, the way you do when you're not sure if someone's talking to you or the person behind you. But when he glanced around and saw no one else in the immediate line, he gave a slight nod, stepped aside, and waited. He wasn't a man who made scenes. The boarding area at Gate C-14 in Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International was crowded, noisy, and tense, in that specific kind of way that always seems to settle over airports. People shifting their bags, toddlers whining, someone pacing while muttering into a Bluetooth earpiece. But none of that fazed James. He stood there quietly, hat in hand, an old brown fedora he'd had since 2001, and waited for the gate agent to speak again. She didn't meet his eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, eyes fixed on her screen. "There's been a seat reassignment. You've been moved to 32B. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed, betraying a flicker of unease, as if she knew the weight of what she was doing, but couldn't stop the system's cold machinery. Now that got his attention. "Ma'am?" he asked gently. No anger, just confusion, soft-spoken. "You were in 2A, correct? That seat is no longer available due to an aircraft change. We had to redistribute a few passengers." Her voice was flat, practiced, like she'd said it 100 times already and didn't want to explain again. James didn't argue. He'd been through far worse in his 70 years. So instead, he gave a tight smile, nodded once, and walked toward the jet bridge. His first-class ticket crumpled slightly in his hand. The paper felt heavier now, a silent testament to a promise broken, and his chest tightened, not with rage, but with the familiar sting of being overlooked, a wound that never fully healed from decades of service. But not everyone ignored what had just happened. 2 rows away, seated near a phone charging station, a young woman named Tasha Simmons noticed. She noticed because she'd been scrolling through her feed reading about a Medal of Honor recipient who'd be attending a veterans event in Washington, D.C., the same one she was flying to. And when she glanced up and saw the face from the article on her screen, standing politely at the gate, that crumpled ticket in hand, something didn't sit right with her. Because the man in that article, the one with the steel gaze and the calm posture, wasn't just anyone. He was Colonel James Thompson, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Afghanistan, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Medal of Honor for leading a rescue mission that saved 11 lives under enemy fire. And now he was being sent to the back of the plane. Tasha leaned to the woman sitting next to her. "That's Colonel James Thompson, the guy they just bunked." "Wait, that guy? You're kidding." "No, look." She held up her phone. The woman frowned. "That's got to be a mistake." "You'd think so." But when James walked down that jet bridge, slow, steady, coat over his arm, no one stopped him. Not a single employee, not the other gate agent, not even the flight attendant who glanced at his boarding pass, then waved him toward the back. Coach, middle seat, between a man who refused to remove his backpack and a teenage boy wearing noise-canceling headphones. He lowered himself into the narrow seat slowly, folding his long legs and adjusting his shoulder. His knees touched the seat in front of him. He didn't complain, but his fingers lingered on the armrest, tracing the worn fabric, as memories of battlefields and betrayals flickered in his mind, moments when trust in systems, in people, had cost him dearly. Behind him, the cabin door hadn't even closed yet when Tasha raised her phone and hit record. "I don't know who needs to hear this," she whispered, "but this man is a war hero, and they just downgraded him from first class without a word." Her voice cracked slightly, a mix of disbelief and defiance, as she angled the camera to catch the quiet dignity in James's posture, a stark contrast to the indignity of the moment. She didn't know what would happen next. She just knew it felt wrong. But someone else in that terminal was already texting someone far higher up the ladder. James Thompson never liked being called a hero. It made him uncomfortable, like he had to justify something. Like surviving 3 tours and watching friends die gave him some kind of moral authority. But in his mind, he was just a retired teacher, a man who did what he had to do because others were counting on him. Born in 1955 in Macon, Georgia, James was raised in a world that told him early on what lanes he was supposed to stay in. But he never did stay in those lanes. He questioned teachers, he walked home through the white part of town on purpose, and at 16, He broke a man's ribs defending his younger brother outside a corner store. They tried to charge him. His mother pleaded. A judge gave him one option, military or jail. He chose the army, and it changed everything. By the time he was 22, James had already done things most men couldn't imagine. He spent nights in the mud, weeks without a real meal, and watched as a friend bled out in his lap while James held his hand. He rose through the ranks the hard way, discipline, loyalty, humility, never once looking for credit, only looking to keep people alive. The Medal of Honor came after his final deployment in Kandahar. He'd pulled injured soldiers out of a burning transport under sniper fire, refused evacuation until every man was out, carried a wounded corporal on his back for half a mile to reach the base perimeter. He never spoke about it unless someone dragged it out of him. Even then, he'd just shrug. I did what anyone would have done. But that wasn't true. What James did made generals salute him. Presidents knew his name, and still he lived alone in a one-story brick house on the west side of Atlanta. Drove a 2015 Toyota Camry, still used a flip phone, and the only reason he was flying to D.C. was because they were naming a facility after him. He didn't want it, but they insisted. Sir, they'd said, your legacy deserves it. So here he was, flying commercial in a blazer that used to fit better, quietly boarding a flight that had somehow reassigned his first-class seat to someone else. He had a copy of The Fire Next Time by Baldwin in his bag, and a bottle of water he paid $5.00 for himself. He wasn't bitter, he just didn't like when things didn't make sense, and this didn't make sense. As he settled into the cramped seat, a faint tremor ran through his hand, not from age, but from the quiet rage of being dismissed. A feeling that echoed back to the days when his valor was met with indifference or worse. "Excuse me, sir?" the teenage boy next to him asked, nudging James gently. "Are you in the military or something?" James smiled. "Used to be." The kid looked embarrassed. "Oh, cool. My dad's a Marine. He's in Kuwait right now. I saw your pin. I didn't mean to bug you." "You didn't," James said, tapping the ribbon on his lapel with one finger. "Tell your father I said thank you." And that was that. James leaned back, let his eyes close, tried not to think too hard about how things had shifted since he hung up his uniform. How some people still looked right through him. How respect came easy when you were in camouflage, but disappeared when you were just another old black man in a line. He didn't want pity, but something about this moment sat wrong. The weight of it pressed harder as the plane's engines hummed. A reminder that even in 2025, the world could still reduce a man's life to a seat number. And back at the gate, the video was already making its way to a woman who wasn't going to stay silent. Tasha Simmons didn't post much on social media. She mostly used her phone for work, group chats, and the occasional late-night scroll through dog videos to calm her nerves. But this time, something told her to press record. She was still standing near the boarding gate, her carry-on at her feet, filming quietly as the last of the passengers lined up to board. The video wasn't polished. No dramatic narration, no background music, just her voice and the raw image of an elderly man, calm, composed, walking to the back of the plane like nobody had just stripped him of something he earned. "I don't usually do this," she said into the mic, "but I just watched this airline downgrade a Medal of Honor recipient to coach. No explanation, no apology, he just went." She uploaded the video to her story and tagged the airline. Less than 3 minutes later, her phone buzzed with comments. Her inbox started to fill. People were sharing it, reposting it, and someone somewhere decided to forward it to a name that had weight behind it. The video's raw honesty hit like a spark in dry grass, igniting a firestorm of reactions. Some outraged, some skeptical, but all demanding answers. Meanwhile, inside the plane, James sat still. A little cramped, but not uncomfortable. He wasn't the type to ask for help, never had been. But a flight attendant, tall, thin, mid-30s, paused by his seat with a tray of drinks and frowned. "Sir," she said, leaning in, "you were in 2A, right?" James glanced up. "I was," she hesitated. "Do you mind if I ask, did you request the seat change?" "No," he said evenly. Her jaw tightened just slightly. Then she nodded once and moved on, but her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer, a silent acknowledgement that something was deeply wrong. and her hurried steps toward the front of the plane hinted at a brewing confrontation. That was the first crack. Back near the gate, Tasha had just found a quiet spot to sit when another passenger, a man in his 50s wearing a sports jacket and scuffed-up shoes, walked up beside her. "You the one filming earlier?" She looked up. "Yeah, why?" He slid a business card across the seat. "My sister works at FAA Oversight. She's about to be real interested in that video." Tasha blinked. "You serious?" "Dead serious." His voice carried a quiet intensity, as if he'd seen too many wrongs go unaddressed and recognized this as a moment to tip the scales. At the same time, on a different phone screen inside a quiet office miles away, the president of Commonwealth Airlines, Omar Brewster, was watching the same footage. The man didn't blink much, didn't speak, as his assistant hovered awkwardly nearby, chewing her lip. "Is this gonna blow up?" she asked finally. He stared at the screen for another beat, then stood. "Get me a suit jacket. We've got 8 minutes before they shut that cabin door. This isn't just a PR nightmare, it's a moral failure, and I won't let it stand," he muttered, his voice low but resolute as he grabbed his phone and dialed a number that could ground the flight if needed. Back on the plane, James closed his eyes again. He didn't know any of this was happening. He didn't know that someone was about to show up on that jet bridge with something to prove, or that the rest of the cabin was about to witness something no one expected. But in that moment, 8 minutes became everything. The last few passengers were squeezing into their rows, stuffing bags into overhead bins when the energy on the jet bridge shifted. You could feel it in the sudden silence from the gate agents, in the way one of them leaned sideways to peer around the corner, whispering something into her radio. Then came the sound of dress shoes, moving fast, purposeful, steady, but not rushed. That sharp click of authority. Omar Brewster didn't do drama. At 49, he'd worked his way up from regional operations to president of Commonwealth Airlines. And he didn't make public appearances unless he absolutely had to. But this wasn't going to be handled with an email apology and a PR-approved statement. Not when the man in 32B was James Thompson. Not when the whole internet was already watching. As he stepped onto the plane, flight attendants stepped aside quickly, unsure of what to say. One of them glanced toward the cockpit. Another whispered, "Is that?" Omar ignored them. He adjusted his jacket, gave a quick nod to the lead flight attendant, then started moving down the aisle. Rows 1 through 10 sat up straighter. By row 20, heads were turning. By 30, even the teenager next to James had pulled off his headphones. James didn't look up at first. He was halfway through a chapter in his Baldwin book, squinting just a little in the low cabin light. But then he heard a voice, smooth, direct, but respectful. "Colonel Thompson." James looked up slowly. "Yes." Omar extended a hand. "Omar Brewster, President of Commonwealth. I believe we made a mistake." James didn't shake his hand right away. He stared for a second, like he was trying to figure out what kind of game was being played here, but he didn't speak. So Omar continued, "Your seat was never supposed to be reassigned. That's on us. I take full responsibility." His voice carried a rare sincerity, but there was an edge to it, a barely concealed fury at the system that had allowed this to happen under his watch. James set his book down carefully, still calm. "And what happens now? We'd like to escort you back to your original seat if you'll allow it." There was a moment, a breath, where James could have said no, could have made a point, could have made it hurt. But instead, he rose to his feet with the same quiet dignity he'd had at the gate. "I appreciate that," he said. No sarcasm, no smugness, just the kind of grace that comes from decades of surviving worse things than bad airline protocol. The teenager in the aisle seat scrambled to make space. Passengers stepped aside. Bones were up, yes, but people were quiet. Not the hush of politeness, more like the silence of witnessing something you know matters. As they made their way to the front, Omar kept his hands at his sides, walking half a step behind. It was intentional. Back in row 2, the seat was still open. James sat down without a word, folded his coat over his lap, stared out the window. Omar leaned in again. "I'm sorry. It shouldn't have happened." James finally turned to look at him. "No, it shouldn't have." Omar nodded. No excuses. Just stood up straight and walked off the plane. No press, no cameras, just accountability. But as he exited, he whispered to the lead flight attendant, "Find out who authorized that reassignment." Heads will roll. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Because the world had already seen the video, and now they were waiting for more. The plane hadn't even pushed back from the gate when Tasha's video hit its first 100,000 views, then 200,000. It spread faster than even she expected, retweeted by veterans, reshared by influencers, commented on by people who couldn't believe what they were seeing. Screenshots of James sitting in 32B began circulating with headlines like "Medal of Honor Hero Moved to Coach" and "Airline Mistreats War Veteran President Steps In." By the time Flight 228 was in the air, the trending hashtags were everywhere. Respect our veterans. She Colonel Thompson Jusher. Honor isn't just a word. Cable news picked it up by mid-afternoon. On The View, someone quoted his calm demeanor as the mark of a true leader. A retired general tweeted, "I served with this man. He once carried 2 injured soldiers under fire while bleeding from his own leg, and y'all put him in the middle seat." But not everyone was praising the moment. Some thought the airline president's actions were a publicity stunt. Others said James should have been upgraded from the start, not rescued in front of a camera. There were debates, op-eds, comment threads that spiraled fast. Through it all, James said nothing. He didn't know yet how big this had gotten. He was in the sky, somewhere above North Carolina, dipping water and rereading a paragraph he'd already read 3 times because his mind kept drifting. The flight attendant came by. She paused, glanced down at him, and said softly, "Colonel, thank you for everything." He nodded, said, "You're welcome," and returned to his book. When the plane landed at Ronald Reagan Airport, there were 3 people waiting at the gate, 2 from the airline, 1 from the Department of Veterans Affairs. They offered a car. He declined. They offered to carry his bags. He refused. Instead, James stepped out of the terminal like any other traveler, rolled his own suitcase behind him, walked past the people staring, and finally paused when he saw a familiar face outside the doors. His niece, Adrienne. She hugged him tight. "Uncle James, you're all over the internet." He raised an eyebrow. "I figured something was going on. You should see what people are saying. You're trending. There's news crews trying to get an interview." "I didn't say anything worth quoting." "Exactly. That's why they're interested." He smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. They walked to the car, the DC air crisp against their skin, the early evening sunlight brushing against the side of James's face. In his mind, this wasn't justice. It was correction. And it shouldn't have taken a camera to make people remember what decency looks like. But the weight of the moment lingered, a reminder that even a correction couldn't erase the initial wound, and he wondered how many others had been quietly dismissed without a viral video to save them. But the moment wasn't finished with him, not yet, because the next morning someone handed James a mic, and the world finally heard his voice. The auditorium was small, just off Massachusetts Avenue. Inside, rows of folding chairs faced a modest stage with an American flag in the corner and a bronze plaque covered by a dark blue sheet. The room smelled faintly of fresh paint and new carpet. It was the kind of place you walked into expecting a quiet dedication, maybe a few polite claps, a lunch after. But on that morning, every seat was filled. Cameras lined the back wall. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder near the exits. Half of them weren't even supposed to be there. They showed up after Tasha's video hit 1 million views overnight. Still, James Carter Thompson walked in the same way he walked into everything. Head up, hands steady, no rush. He wore a charcoal gray suit with a crisp white shirt, the same one he used to wear to funerals and veterans' dinners. The Medal of Honor ribbon sat just above his heart. His shoes, polished black leather, moved quietly over the tile. Adrienne was at his side. She squeezed his hand before he stepped up to the podium. The room fell silent. A man from the VA gave the introduction. 2 minutes, respectful. He called James a pillar of duty, listed his medals, talked about service above self, but when he finished and stepped aside, no one clapped right away. They were waiting on James. He stood still for a second, scanning the room like he was back at roll call. No nerves, just measuring the weight of what he was about to say. He adjusted the mic. "Most of you don't know me," he began, voice low but firm. "You know the idea of me. You saw a video, you read a headline, but I'm just a man. A man who spent more time trying to do the right thing than worrying about what people think of him. He paused. I didn't want this ceremony. I didn't ask for that building to have my name, and I sure didn't want to become a symbol of what happens when the system forgets who built it. A murmur ran through the crowd, he continued. I served this country not because it was perfect, but because I believed in what it could be. Because I believed in people, in duty, in sacrifice. But belief doesn't mean blindness. I've seen how fast people look past you when your uniform's in the closet. How quick they are to assume or ignore or move you to the back of the plane. He let that hang for a second. Then he said, what happened wasn't about a seat. It was about how easy it is to strip someone of their dignity without even realizing it. Or worse, without caring. Silence. Absolute. And I don't say this with anger. I say it with hope because I saw people speak up. I saw strangers, young people, stand up for someone they didn't even know. That tells me something. That tells me we're not done. That tells me maybe, just maybe, we're still worth fighting for. A pause, deep breath. I don't need thanks. I don't need parades. I need truth. I need respect. And I need us to remember that service doesn't expire. You don't stop honoring someone just because the war ended. He stepped back from the mic. Nobody clapped at first. They were too stunned. Then someone stood, then another. Then the whole room was on its feet, even the cameramen. And still James didn't smile. He just nodded once, stepped off the stage and took his seat. But as he sat, his gaze lingered on the flag in the corner, and for a fleeting moment, a shadow crossed his face, a flicker of doubt about whether words, even honest ones, could mend a fracture so deep. But the country didn't just hear the words, they felt them. And the reaction wasn't over yet. By the end of the week, the clip of James's speech had been viewed over 12 million times. It wasn't flashy, no music, no editing, just the raw video. An old man in a gray suit telling the truth. And somehow that was louder than all the noise. Talk shows ran segments, editorials followed, celebrities posted tributes, veterans came forward with similar stories. Quiet downgrades, whispered disrespect, empty apologies. But something different happened this time. People listened. Commonwealth Airlines announced a full internal review of its boarding and reassignment procedures. They introduced a new policy honoring service members living or retired with guaranteed upgraded seating when available. They named it the Thompson Protocol. James hadn't asked for that either. The White House press secretary gave a brief statement. What happened to Colonel Thompson was unacceptable. What happened afterward, though, that gives us hope. But James never made another statement. He didn't do a press tour, didn't sell the story. When news vans showed up outside his house in Atlanta, he didn't answer the door. He was done talking. One afternoon, about a month after the incident, James sat on his porch with Adrian. She was reading a letter aloud, another thank you note from a stranger. Dear Colonel Thompson, I saw your speech. It reminded me of my grandfather. He was treated like a ghost in his last years. You reminded me not to let that happen again to anyone. She looked up. That's the 6th one today. James didn't say much, just nodded and looked out across the lawn. The sun was starting to drop low, casting long shadows across the concrete. You think anything really changed? Adrienne asked. James took a while to answer. Some things don't change overnight, but sometimes people do. And that's where it starts. He tapped the side of his old flip phone, checking the time, then added, the thing is, respect shouldn't have to be earned after it's already been paid in full. Adrienne leaned her head against his shoulder. You always talk like you're giving a speech. James chuckled. Nah, just too old to waste words. Across the country, other conversations were happening on buses and schools and barber shops and boardrooms about respect, about aging, about what dignity actually looks like when no one's watching. The video was still being shared, but now it was more than outrage, it was reflection. And for every person who saw James's face and thought of their own father or uncle or grandmother, someone who gave everything and got too little in return, it struck a chord that didn't fade the next day. Because people weren't just talking about James anymore. They were talking about themselves, their neighbors, their country, and what kind of future they wanted to live in. Let this be a reminder. Sometimes it takes one quiet voice to shake the room, one man to sit still so the rest of us remember how to stand up. If this story moved you, tell someone about it. Call your parents, thank a veteran, respect the people who came before you, not just in words, but in action. Because dignity isn't a gift, it's a right.